The year 2017 was an important year for Syria. In November, with the liberation of the town of Abu Kamal, the last major stronghold over which the Islamic State had territorial control, the IS was declared finished, bringing the war-torn country to a crossroads of where to go next. In the past few years, we have already seen peace talks between the Syrian government and the oppositions, brokered by the United Nations, fizzling to a close without any progress being achieved. Russia, Iran and Turkey, meanwhile, offered an olive branch with the Astana talks, but to what extent can these mechanisms work and bring lasting peace to Syria? Another issue is post-war reconstruction. With the political uncertainty and such a large number of refugees or internally displaced people, how big are the challenges facing the Syrian government, and what does Syria need from the international community on this regard? I'm very honored to be joined in the studio by His Excellency Imad Moustapha, Syria's Ambassador to China. Your Excellency, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, as I mentioned, it's been 7 years since the Syrian war started. How would you describe the year of 2017 in terms of the events?
It's been a pivotal year. You rightly mentioned that 2017 witnessed the end of ISIL in Syria. The last stronghold of ISIL fell down, and I can say that now, 2018, we can start talking about the comprehensive political solution and the beginning of the new phase in Syria. I'm not saying it's over. I'm saying that the worst moment has been passed already.
Well, before we talk about the new phase that you mentioned, still there are reports about tens of thousands of IS fighters in Syria. So what kind of challenges there still remain in bringing this anti-terrorist war to a close? Has there been any winner-losing party to that?
Well, first, let me say that the Syrian crisis was not only about ISIL. At one point, there were 1,200 different armed terrorist groups in Syria. One of them, maybe the most notorious, was ISIL. Not necessarily the most ferocious. The most ferocious, as far as we were concerned, was the Nusra Front. Right now, while we are talking, our armed forces are engaged in fierce battles with the Nusra Front in the very last pocket they have in Syria, in Idlib province, near the Turkish borders. So as you can see, it's not about ISIL defeated or they are still there. It's about, are there other armed terrorist groups that are wreaking havoc in Syria or not? In general, 90% of these groups have been wiped away, defeated, crushed. There are still pockets, and they are important pockets, but they are mostly in remote areas now. Almost all major cities in Syria, except for one single city, now are free of armed, lawless groups. And right now, our army is engaged in a final battle for the very last city in Syria that is still under armed terrorist groups, which is Idlib. Now, Idlib has a large contingent of fighters that have a link to China, the East Turkestan Liberation Front. And they are also fierce fighters, and they are common enemies to both Syria and China, because they are one of the hardened terrorist groups in Syria that have been fighting us for the past 7 years.
How daunting is that challenge? Do you foresee in 2018 that major progress can be made on that front?
We are now very optimistic. As I said before, the worst days are over. They are behind us now. Actually, now they are even collapsing before being engaged in actual battle, because their morale is very low now. As you can imagine, a military engagement is not only about how many personnel and what ammunition and arms you have, but it's also about the prospects for the battle. They have been on the defeat continuously for the past 18 months, and now it's not taking the same amount of effort and time to defeat their pockets here and there as it used to be like 3 or 4 years ago when they dominated a large part of the Syrian territory.
Now let's talk about the prospects of finding a political solution to the crisis. You were mentioning this being a new phase in the development of situation. Now last December, the 8th round of the UN-sponsored talks ended without progress. I remember certainly between 2011 and 2016, end of 2016, I was in Geneva and I covered, really I can't remember how many rounds of UN-sponsored talks. It has been frustrating. And one of the sticking points has always been the future of President Assad. So looking ahead at 2018, I guess that is that still a sticking point?
Well, it depends on how you are looking at it and which party is involved and which perspective you are approaching. Let me remind you first that the talks in Geneva have been with the so-called opposition that have 3 problems. The first problem, they do not have any influence or leverage on any fighting group in Syria whatsoever. So even if you conclude 100% agreements with those opposition groups, nothing will change on the ground in Syria, because the actual groups that we are fighting on Syria have no relation whatsoever with the so-called opposition group that attended Geneva. First. Second, another big problem, they do not have any popular constituency in Syria whatsoever. They are mostly, and when I am saying mostly, I really mean the overwhelming majority of them are expatriates who have been living in France, the United States, Western Europe for the past 20 years. They are completely, totally disconnected with the Syrian masses, with the Syrian people that are actually suffering on the ground in Syria. Third, and this is the most important problem, these groups, and I'm not trying now to belittle them or anything, it's just the reality as it is. Each one of these groups are being paid and manipulated by a single, a certain regional or international power. Each one of them gets their orders and their directives and their money and their supplies and everything from a backer. And so each one of them really has to attune to the desires, political desires and whims of their backers. And these backers have different agendas for Syria. At certain points they used to have the same agenda as the Saudi and the Qatari agenda towards Syria. And then the Saudis and the Qataris fought against each other, and suddenly the Syrian, so-called Syrian opposition groups that hold loyalty to Saudi Arabia or to Qatar suddenly became hostile to each other, in addition to being hostile to us. So that was really a major difficulty regarding those groups. Having said this, this was not the only peace track that was being promoted.
Right.
On the ground, Turkey, which holds leverage on many fighting groups, Iran and Russia held talks in Astana between Syria and the groups who are fighting on the ground, and we achieved agreements called de-escalation agreements. These de-escalation agreements had effect on the ground in Syria because, as I said, they were between groups that are not disconnected and disengaged from what was going on around the world.
Let's talk about that Astana process in just a moment. First of all, share with us the vision of the Syrian government or of the government of President Assad for the future of the country. After 7 years of fighting, how are you looking at the future of that country? In what form can the government be? A power-sharing government, between whom, how it can be formed? You know, this is the kind of vision that will guide you to how to get there.
That's wonderful. First, the Astana talks only led to de-escalation of violence. They were not political talks. The most important political talks will take place very soon, this month, in Sochi, in Russia. More than 1,200 representatives of the Syrian people will convene there to discuss exactly what you have just said, the political future of Syria. The Syrian government does not have a monopoly on the vision for Syria. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not we are saying we won on the ground, we will impose our political will. We have made a very clear distinction between winning on the ground, because these are, regardless of how the West describe them, these are terrorist groups, armed terrorist militias. Either they surrender their arms and they reintegrate with the Syrian society and the Syrian state, or we fight them. We have no other option. Having said this, meetings like the one that is planned this January, end of January in Sochi, where representatives of different factions and different groups, different political parties, different ethnic groups, religious groups, however you call them, they are there. We'll discuss the future of Syria, how Syria should proceed, how Syria should move forward. And this would be based on the choice of the Syrian people, not on any foreign intervention, not on any dictated agenda by a foreign power. This is exactly what we want, and we are very hopeful for Sochi.
How about the parties that have been going to the UN talks, and after all, that is a mechanism that has been brokered by the United Nations, which has been trying to play a very important role in there. How are their aspirations could possibly be reflected as part of the process you are mentioning, and how can the UN's role be integrated in that Sochi process?
This is a complex question. I'll tell you why, and I will be candid with you. The United Nations, as an organization, is supposed to be neutral, is supposed to be objective. But here is the problem. It is controlled by the powers that actually control the United Nations, and you know them very well. And these powers imposed on the Geneva Tract a certain color of opposition, to the exclusion of other different components of the Syrian opposition. They gave themselves the right to say who is opposition and who is not opposition. Sochi is comprehensive, inclusive. Everybody, including these guys, is invited to Sochi. So you have the whole spectrum of Syrian people in Sochi. In Geneva, you only have the opposition sanctioned by the West. Only, definitely. I can give you a very important example. The whole Kurdish population of Syria, the whole of them, are excluded from the United Nations Geneva peace talks. Why? Because one of the powers said the Kurds cannot be represented. So as you can see, there is a major difference between the United Nations sponsored peace talks, who really are under the influence of the superpowers, and between the Sochi calls that have been based on the principle of inclusivity, all opposition, no exclusion of anyone.
You were talking about the Kurdish groups.
Just as an example.
Yeah, before we go into the break, are you saying the Kurdish groups are also being invited to the Sochi talks? What about the Turkish government's position on this regard?
Of course, the Turkish government continues to oppose this. And anyway, the developments, the recent developments that took place recently between the Kurds and the Turks, and between the Kurds and the United States, unfortunately, have further complicated the situation. The actions of both the United States and Turkey, recent actions in Syria, are not helping move forward towards a comprehensive, peaceful resolution of the Syrian crisis. They are adding more complexities to the already intricate situation in Syria. So it's very, very difficult right now to judge how this will be addressed. Most probably elements from the Kurdish population will be represented in Sochi in large numbers, but not the major party that Turkey is fighting right now in Syria.
You've been watching The Point on CGTN. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after that. Welcome back. I have been talking to the Syrian Ambassador to China, His Excellency Imad Moustapha. Ambassador Moustapha, now the talks will be ongoing, so we'll be watching what happens. However, on the military situation on the ground, as you mentioned, there are still fierce fighting to recapture some of the central towns. What kind of challenge is it for the Syrian government forces or for the Syrian government to maintain the territorial integrity of that country. Is some kind of a Somalization acceptable for the Syrian government?
Absolutely not, in principle, and on the reality it's far from the Somali situation. Right now the government of Syria controls almost 95% of the Syrian cities, with almost 85% of the population in Syria. And Syrian troops, as I said, are engaged right now in a battle for the very, very final pocket that is still under the Nusra Front control. Only 2 days ago we achieved a major military victory there, and our troops continue to advance, and we will not stop. This is not something to be compromised or to be negotiated. We will never stop till every single square inch of Syria is free of the armed groups and is reintegrated into the motherland. So there is no situation whatsoever compared to Somalia.
Well, over the past few years, it has been with the help of Russian forces that the Syrian government has been able to turn around the situation on the ground to this day. Right now, Russia has declared its partial withdrawal from Syria, and some people are saying with Russian forces being withdrawn from Syria, is it still possible for President Assad's forces to stabilize the situation until the very end that you described?
You need to remember that at one point, according to United Nations figures and to international intelligence agencies estimates, more than 120,000 foreign fighters influxed Syria. So yes, it's true, at one point international radical Islamic jihadists made our job really difficult in Syria. And yes, thanks to the Russian intervention, the situation has changed dramatically. Today, Russia only provides air support. We already have a very effective air force, but the Russians are also contributing with their air raids against the remaining terrorist pockets in Syria. But our army is well organized, hardened, well trained, and they are capable of completing the job and of maintaining the country safe and stable. It is sad to say it, but I have to say it, the overwhelming majority of those who came into Syria to establish their international jihadi caliphate in Syria are already dead now. So it's not, the threat is not a lingering threat.
What about some soldiers, troops by the United States who have been lingering, and the United States or US President Donald Trump has talked about the need or the plan to keep these soldiers indefinitely in Syria? How is that going to impact the situation?
This is very, very grave. We regard this with great concern, and we will never accept it. Any foreign soldier on Syrian troops without the permission of the Syrian government is considered as an occupation and an aggression. It is our duty and our right to kick them out from Syria. We will never ever accept their presence in Syria, and they have to leave. Right now we are still engaged in the last battles with the pockets of armed groups here and there. But at one point we have to confront whoever is inside Syria without the permission of the Syrian government. We do not have the luxury of allowing countries like the United States to send their troops to our country without our permission. This is an infringement on international law and on our national sovereignty. No country will ever accept this.
In terms of reconstruction, I believe people can't wait to get back to their normal life. The economy has also been severely devastated. What has been the damage, and what is being done already by the government to bring the country back on the right track?
This is a very interesting story, and it is a story that deserves to be told and retold. Syria has not waited a single moment to re-engage in reconstruction. Every town, every village, every city we managed to liberate during the past 5 years, we immediately engaged in a major reconstruction program. This is never usually covered by the Western media. The Western media only loves to cover the destruction, the wreckage, the death, the agony. But once their favorite armed groups are out of a place and we start re-engagement and populations start to come back, it is never covered by the media. Take Aleppo as an example. The major capital, economic capital of Syria, that was devastated during the war, that was liberated a year ago. Before it was liberated by our troops, the images from Aleppo were omnipresent on every Western media source. Okay? Once they were kicked out of Aleppo, Aleppo is outside the map now. Nobody knows anything what's going on in Aleppo. Let me tell you what's going on in Aleppo now. As of day one, the government started cleaning the streets, reconstruction, removing the rubble. People started coming back in large numbers. In the past year, 800,000 people who have left Aleppo before have come back to Aleppo. Aleppo is reopening its manufacturing industrial plants. The economy is restarting in Aleppo. I'm not telling you now Aleppo is paradise. I'm telling you Aleppo has already regained life, and people are coming to Aleppo, coming back after they have left it for years. And this is the story. When the Western powers cry about Syrian refugees, we tell them, these are crocodile tears because you caused this problem. You stop the fighting, you stop arming those groups, the people will come back to their cities. And the proof is what's happening right now in Aleppo and in other places in Syria. What I'm trying to tell you, and this is very important, yes, we need peace to prevail across Syria so that we can engage in a major reconstruction program, but we cannot afford to wait till this happens. Wherever we can start working, we are working immediately. And today the Syrian economy, after the huge damage that it has suffered during the past 5 years, is already now on the upturn. It's already gaining momentum. The Syrian currency has already increased its value. Exports have already resumed from Syria towards regional markets. I'm not telling you the economy now is in a rosy situation. I'm telling you it's in a healthy recovering situation, and we will continue to move forward.
Yeah. What kind of support do you need from the rest of the world?
Well, this depends on what sort of a world. We do not expect the Western countries that have provided financial and armed assistance to the armed groups to come and help us build the cities that they have contributed towards their destruction. But countries like China, like Russia, like India, like South Africa, we have many friends around the world, like Brazil, we expect them to help us in the reconstruction. And we do not expect this to happen as a charity. We are looking for a partnership based on a win-win cooperation. We believe there is magnificent opportunities for reconstruction in Syria, infrastructure particularly. We believe, as an example, Chinese big companies can join in this reconstruction program, and we believe that this can take place on the basis of mutual benefit. Of course, aid and assistance is required. I'm not saying it is not, but it's just a small part of the picture. The real picture is come and help us rebuild the country, and the benefits will be shared.
China's role in the conflict has been different from the other parties in the UN Security Council China has donated funds, donated aid, but China has vetoed, but China has stopped from militarily intervening in the situation. How would you comment on China's role in the situation so far, and how do you look at China's role, specific roles in the future? You talked about infrastructure. Let's not be hiding. China has a lot of infrastructure projects to cooperate with countries around the world. So what kind of opportunities is Syria seeing in there?
Let me start by telling you that the Syrian people today feel deep, profound gratitude towards China. they will never ever forget that China stood with us in a most difficult juncture in our history. We believe China took the right side of history, and we are, as I said, deeply touched by the friendship that China had shown us during our difficult times. A friend in need is a friend indeed. China has used the veto on behalf of Syria, despite the fact that China usually does not use the veto at the Security Council. It does not have this tradition. But China did use the veto repeatedly on behalf of Syria. We feel great gratitude towards China. When China also understood the nature of the conflict.
Well, China was not really protecting Syria as a country per se. China stood by a certain principle in its foreign diplomacy.
Exactly. China understood that what was going on in Syria was really a major world power conflict, geopolitical conflict. It was not something as portrayed in the West. And China's attitude was, hands off Syria, let the Syrian people by themselves decide what they want for the future of Syria. And of course China was very careful not to allow the Western powers to repeat in Syria what they did in Libya, ending up with the total disintegration and destruction of Libya. So China had the wisdom and the principled position to do what it did in the United Nations Security Council. And of course, during the past 6-7 years, China provided a lot of humanitarian aid to Syria, which was most welcome. And now the big Chinese companies are poised to come and engage in major infrastructure reconstruction in Syria. China, as you have rightly alluded, as maybe, let me use the term, an overcapacity of production. And we need today, these big Chinese companies to come and give their expertise, their power, their know-how, and their resources in rebuilding Syria. And again, we do not expect this as a charity. We expect this as a common vision for a shared growth and for a shared creation of wealth.
Well, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to you, Your Excellency, the Syrian Ambassador to China, Imad Moustapha.
Thank you.
And that is it for this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, here on CGTN. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.